between 30 and 50,000 Russian troops were massing in the area. But every time you do that, the price of oil goes up. There was a grave risk that American weapons were being used in breach of international law.
But as war, a 1-to-1 ratio between civilians and the military is unheard of. Hamas's intent is to destroy Israel. But if you're Israel, then you see this as a war of national survival.
I disagree.
With big following on social media, talking about the 7th of October as that Hamas thing. In the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, is aid being used as a weapon? Each individual missile can destroy 2,000 Hiroshimas.
A very warm welcome to you all for this week's Red Matrix podcast. It's been a very busy week this week. Look across in the war in Ukraine, and Russia appears to have opened up a second front there. That could have profound implications for the future of that war. We're also going to have a look at the war in Gaza. At the moment, the aid appears to be starting to be used as a weapon, and that's very sensitive.
And one very pithy subject, Satan II, one of Russia's intercontinental ballistic missiles. It's the biggest and it's got the longest range of anything else in the world.
Busy podcast.
So Sean, there's been a development in the Ukraine war. Russia appears to be opening up a second front, which is a bit worrying. And as an example of how serious Zelensky might be taking this, he's cancelled all his foreign trips, which is unusual for him because, you know, he loves them and he finds them an important part of getting assets and support for the activity in Ukraine. Is this serious? I mean, what's actually happening?
Yeah, it definitely feels quite serious, doesn't it? I mean, when the announcement was that Zelensky was cancelling these trips, I heard a couple of people just talking about it sort of frivolously as saying, oh, well, he's just not going abroad. His role is absolutely essential because every time he goes to one of these visits, he gets offered more aid, he signs stuff. So it's actually vital to the war effort. So the question is, he obviously thinks this is quite serious. The worry is this second front, and it's up till now, the war, Russia's on the front foot in the Donbass, and we've always assumed that this special military operation, Putin's never called it a war, is all about securing the Donbass, the land bridge down to Crimea, and if those three areas are secure, then he might pause. So now all of a sudden he's opened up just to the northeast of Kharkiv, a little town called Vovchansk, a little settlement near the border. Russia's made a big push there, and also Lipsy, which is just about 20 kilometers northwest of that as well. Now, Ukraine was aware this was probably going to happen. For the last few months, they've been warning that between 30 and 50,000 Russian troops were massing in the area, but they were not allowed to use Western weapons to attack because it was on Russian soil. And now this front's opened up.
So the front is on Ukraine land?
Yes, Russia's pushing into Ukraine.
How far in are they?
They're only a couple of kilometres in so far, but apparently at this town Vovchansk, the trouble is with land, there's an area they've taken which is quite substantial, which is lots of settlements. And there's lots of talk about how come they just walked in. We don't generally build defensive lines right on the border because they can be struck by artillery really easily. You tend to have those defensive lines a bit further back, a bit closer to Kharkiv. So although it's alarming, the question is, can you stop Russia having a breakthrough? I think for me, there's two potential explanations for this, one of which, the most dangerous, is Russia's gone, Ukraine's short of weapons. The international support is waning. Actually, we're going to go after Kyiv. We're going to go after the capital. We're going to subjugate Ukraine, and we're going to take the capital, Kyiv. We tried to do this a couple of years ago. Didn't work. We're going to do it now. And a stepping stone for that would be to take Kharkiv. It's on its way. That is credible, but most of the military analysts, the Institute of Studies of War, all of them think that Russia has taken such a bruising that it doesn't have the military capability to do that at the moment. Might be wrong, but that's the assessment. What looks far more likely is that we have talked about Belgorod a little bit, which is a little Russian town just inside Russia's border. It's about 20 kilometers away from the border, but that is a military logistics hub, and regularly Ukraine attack it because it's actually just within artillery range of Ukraine. And because it's been so badly attacked, Putin has regularly pledged that he'll create a buffer zone, in other words, push Ukrainian forces back so they can't keep attacking Belgorod. So it's quite possible that this is actually just an operation by Putin to create that buffer zone. Why has he also gone in 20 kilometers northwest? Well, most military analysts believe he wants to put pressure on Kharkiv and put his artillery pieces within 25 miles of Kharkiv. So by pushing in over there, he also potentially puts Kharkiv under threat. But unfortunately, the big picture here is that whatever the tactical reasons are, what it's actually doing is it's spreading Ukrainian forces on a much broader front. They haven't got the people, they haven't got the weapons, they haven't got the artillery pieces. And until those arrive, that means that they're spread even more thinly on the front line. And that makes them more vulnerable in the Donbass, which we still think is the main effort for President Putin.
Well, the last time we spoke about this, we surmised that some of this stuff's not going to arrive until next year.
Absolutely right. And but what's been interesting is that so you've had Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State, turn up this last week. Why is he there now?
I know why.
Go on.
Well, he was on a stage performing.
There was an irony, wasn't there?
I think the optics of that probably weren't that great.
No, and he's, by all accounts, he's quite a good guitarist, but it just feels a bit odd that what could be a really seminal moment for Ukraine. I have no doubt one of the things he's there doing is saying, Zelensky, what do you need now? Because we've got this 60 billion money approved, but what's the priority of stuff that you want in? I'd imagine Zelensky is probably going to him, will you stop limiting how we use American weapons? Because we've known about these Russians across the border. We couldn't attack them. If you could let us use some American weapons to attack them, we could have resolved that. And the other bit, I wouldn't be at all surprised if Blinken is going, I know you're attacking Russian oil and refineries, but every time you do that, the price of oil goes up, and that domestically is very difficult. And that, I think, is a fascinating dynamic. I'd love to see those conversations because Zelensky will turn around and go, what? I need to stop Putin generating the revenues he needs, and yet you're telling me that it's a bit uncomfortable for a domestic audience. And I suspect what Blinken's doing is going, I know, but it was difficult enough to get $60 billion of aid through. This is one of the sensitive areas. But it just feels that at the moment, America's doing an amazing job providing support. But if Zelensky can't use those weapons as he needs to on the battlefield, that could come back to bite them.
So some time ago, Israel was going to go into Rafah. Then they didn't go in. Then they were going to go in. And they didn't go in, then they were going to go in again, then they didn't go in. Why not? What is holding them up?
It's a fascinating conundrum, isn't it? I'm drawn to it because before Ramadan, Netanyahu made clear, if the hostages aren't out by the end of Ramadan, we're coming in to Rafah. Why Rafah? The last 4 battalions of Hamas fighters, about 2,000 fighters, the last stronghold, and Netanyahu was clear he wanted to finish the job. And yet, he's not actually gone on at the time of filming. Yes, there's been lots of action. There's lots of warnings to the population to leave. But something is clearly stopping Netanyahu getting on with this. Now, part of it, the international community has become very worried about Netanyahu going in because with 1.4 million relocated personnel in the area that were all there because the Rafah crossing and the Kerem Shalom crossing are where the aid comes in, so they're near where the aid comes in. So why on earth would they leave again? They were told to go down there. Why would they leave? And Biden and Rishi Sunak both said we haven't seen a plan to look after the civilians. And of course, the International Court of Justice had ruled that actually Israel needed to do more to protect the civilians. So behind this,
but in that they didn't find that they hadn't been. So they didn't make a judgment that they hadn't. So it seemed to me that what they were saying was encouragement, which obviously we all want.
Encouragement for what?
To do more.
Yes.
But what they weren't saying, if it's not a sort of conundrum, they weren't saying they hadn't done enough in terms of the legalities of it, but they were encouraging them to do more.
Yes,
there is a difference.
There is, absolutely. But the International Court of Justice doesn't normally come to judgments in days, weeks or months. It's normally years. So given that this war will all be long over by the time they actually make a judgment, what was interesting that they took the unprecedented step of saying, yeah, but as a casual observer, more needs to be done.
But I've heard lots of people jumping on some of these things, saying this is an answer, and the court have had to stand up and say, no, it's not an answer. We're thinking about it.
Yeah, but I think you're absolutely right. But one of the things that's been fascinating about this is America also commissioned a report back in February after the ICJ had made their ruling to find out whether US weapons were being used in accordance with international law. Hoping, I suspect, that would be yes, they are compliant. That report was meant to come out, I think, a week ago today, was delayed. And when Antony Blinken briefed it, I'd love to read the report itself, but apparently it was very critical of Israel's performance. It ruled that there was a grave risk that American weapons were being used in breach of international law, but it fell short of actually stating that they were being used in breach of international law. So I think somebody described it as immense tap dancing and the use of the English language to try and avoid actually coming to a judgment. But the point is that if you're now in Biden's shoes, you want to be really careful that up till now, Israel has claimed it's doing all it can to protect the civilians. It's now on the cusp of going into the most densely populated part of Gaza. And America's going...
Yeah, but why is America doing that? And you know my opinion.
Go on.
It's a generalised one, so it may not specifically apply. But Biden's got almost every university in America shut down with riots and sit-ins and violence. It's been a very difficult situation. All those people are voters. Well, most of them are voters. So he's treading a very fine line.
He is, and it's been interesting to see how politically, because we're in a similar sort of position in this country, aren't we? It's not, we're in an election year. The government has wholeheartedly supported Israel throughout all of this, as has Biden. But there are concerns, I think, in the international community and in the general public that say that doesn't give you a blank check to go in and lead to the devastation that we've now seen on the ground. The casualty numbers still continue to spiral. And that sense of unease, which the International Court of Justice is meant to be an independent arbiter of that. And whilst we can all be cynical about, but the very fact it made a judgment, and that made life very difficult for Biden. And as you say, how he plays, you can't keep both sides happy. We found whenever we're talking about Israel, you're either for us or you're against us. There's no middle ground in this at all. And politically, I think that makes life very, very difficult.
For the politicians, very difficult. But, I listen to, content and opinions from lots of different sides, people who decide to, have a say. And one I was listening to the other day said, the casualties are growing. And somebody said that if you look at wars in general, particularly urban wars, and you look at the ratio of civilian casualties to military, which is what Hamas is, then the one-to-one, which it might well be in this situation, because we were at 30,000 some time ago, that's risen since, analysts, not all of them, were saying this about half, 15,000 of those are Hamas. And the calculation then is this is actually pretty good. Now, it's war. One death is too much. But as war, a one-to-one ratio between civilians and the military is unheard of.
Part of, and it's a really delicate subject, isn't it? One of the reasons that, from a military perspective, I'm uncomfortable when you clarify this as a war is that when you incongruousness about that argument. Part of the war is that when we had our last war against Germany, the German population was manning the factories. They were generating the war material. It was a war of national survival for the world. It was total war. And therefore, that's where... So when you put the label war against it, suddenly you're fighting not only the German Nazis, you're also fighting the German people. If you try and look at what's happening in Gaza, are the Palestinian people part of this war? And the danger is that from a purely more academic perspective, this feels more like a counterinsurgency. The West has described Hamas as terrorists, and therefore separated them ideologically from the population. And if you're going to take on a terrorist organisation and you do a counterinsurgency operation, that's hearts and minds. You do your level best to protect the civilian population.
You used this before, Sean, but on the one hand, you call them brigades. On the other hand, when it's about are they really in a war, you call them counterinsurgents. You know, I think the nuance here is sort of beyond me a bit. You know, Hamas's intent is to destroy Israel. They have said, whatever happens, if one is left, they will go on and do what happened on the 7th of October, time and time and time again. We pretty much now know this is a proxy war for Iran. Iran's intent is the same. They've got more muscle and more money. So if you're Israel, not defending what they're doing, you know, at all, but if you're Israel, then you see this as a war of national survival, and you are going to do whatever you can.
I disagree. I disagree because as a military guy, you're looking at how to win and you develop a strategy to win. If you follow through the war analogy, then you've got to wipe out every single Palestinian before you've won. And that would be the genocide. And that's what the International Court of Justice has made a ruling about.
They haven't made a ruling that so far it's genocide.
You're absolutely right. But they've made an unprecedented statement at this early stage that said, at face value, more needs to be done to protect the civilian population. And therefore, if you see the Palestinians as a threat, then that takes you down a certain path. If you see Hamas as the threat, Hamas being funded by Iran, that is a different military operation that you need to take on. And I think that's where the blurring of the lines here about, is it Hamas? Is it the Palestinians? Is it about territory? And it's not entirely clear to me, and there's a lot of anger around this. So some of the actions have been driven more by emotion than actual military logic. And as I say, we've said consistently through this, I appreciate I sometimes come over as a Palestinian sympathiser, but it's more because our country is pro-Israel, and I'm very firmly in the pro-humanity section of this. I cannot see that there's a military solution to this at all. In fact, one of the bits of news this week was that as Israel had been through the north of Gaza, through the centre of Gaza, was now poised to do the final chapter of this, go in to take out the last 4 battalions of Hamas, which is what Israel described it as. But actually in the north, just to the south of Gaza City, in the north of Gaza, Hamas is still popping out of the tunnel network. On one particular day last week in Al Zaytun, which is one of the regions, militias, 17 different attacks on one day. They're not dead and gone. Israel's gone through that region twice before, and under conventional war, they'd have cleared out or killed or captured everybody. But because Hamas is still using the tunnel network, they still have the will to fight, they still have the means to fight, and they're still fighting. So even when you go into Rafah, does that mean you're going to destroy Hamas?
How long has the conflict been going on for?
8 months now, is it?
You mentioned the Second World War. That was 6 years.
Yeah.
3 million civilians, most of whom were completely innocent. This is bloody. And it may not end that quickly.
No, and the danger is when you look at the numbers relate to Second World War. I think somebody said it was 20% of Germany had been levelled or flattened in some way. If you look at how much of Gaza has gone now, it's phenomenal. And the legacy of hatred that's being built, this is, the problems that caused this in the first place are not being eased at all. And the international community has not engaged yet. And we've said before, but what worries me slightly is an election year for the US and an election year for the UK. are we really going to commit ourselves to the long haul to find an enduring solution for this?
I doubt it. And all the while, we get very prominent commentators in the US with in the UK with big following on social media, talking about the 7th of October as that Hamas thing. We are never going to find a resolution to this at all. Sean, I can't think of a better way of asking you this question. In the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, is aid being used as a weapon?
That's a good start. The trouble is, part of me thinks it is now. By Israel.
By Israel.
If you remember, before the conflict, there were 500 trucks a day needed in Gaza just to sustain the status quo. Israel had stopped some of the aid going through, closed the Erez crossing. The two crossing points to the south, Rafah and Kerem Shalom, were the only routes in. And although Israel said they weren't stopping aid, that they were allowing it, there's been no shortage of international aid. But even on the good days, only about 20%, 30% of the aid that was required was getting in it. And of late, it's been significantly less than that. If Israel wants to go into Rafah, in the south of the country, they've got to get the civilian population away. At the moment, there's an umbilical there, which is they need food. They're desperate, humanitarian crisis. Over the last few days, Israel closed the Rafah crossing and the Kerem Shalom crossing. In other words, severing aid. And for several days, we understood there was no aid getting into Gaza at all. Now, as a military guy, I look at that and go, okay, what they're trying to do is to break the umbilical, tying those civilians to the southern border. They're telling the civilian population to move up to an area called Al-Mawazi, which is up on the coast. They've opened up the Erez crossing. Now, they've told the civilian population they can't go north, but at least it means the aid will come through. And the great white hope was that the Americans were building this big pontoon because they were saying you can't keep coming in by the land routes and Israel stopping it going in. Because Israel's been really clear, we don't want this aid to be feeding our enemy. We don't want it to be feeding Hamas. And therefore, we've got to control it.
The pontoon's ready, but not been...
Well, it was offered a couple of months ago. It had to sail from the US. A couple of weeks ago, it was being built. So the way it works is a big sort of floating pontoon a few miles out to sea in the deep water, so the big ships can get to it. Then they offload the cargo onto this pontoon. Then you get some logistics ships that then take it off that, bring it to a jetty, and then they drive it ashore. Now, this big pontoon was being built, but the bad weather last week apparently delayed it. So they dragged it across to Ashdod, which is the port just a bit further north of Gaza in Israel. We understand that's all finished now. We understand that the 500-metre jetty that goes out for these little boats to ferry backwards and forwards is now ready, but hasn't been hooked up yet. And we also understand that the US has commissioned a ship called the Sagamore. We'll get a picture of it for you. But why is that important? It's because it's got a crane on it, 2 cranes, that can literally take the big pallets, lift them off and put them onto itself, take them onto towards this jetty and unload them again. This was all apparently finished and ready to go. And at the end of last week, the first ship set sail from Cyprus with aid that was due to be offloaded onto this pontoon. Where is it? Why hasn't it started?
This is Israel making sure it doesn't happen, is it?
I don't know. I mean, because this was a US initiative, and because it's at sea, the politics of it, who knows? But the US had said, we'll set up all this facility, but we will not put boots on the ground. So we will not create the security environment in Gaza itself for this to come ashore. We will do everything else, but we won't put it ashore. There was speculation that the UK might put some boots on the ground. They said we won't. Israel, therefore, is a key part of enabling that aid. And I don't know why it's not started delivering. It's not through weather. If it's true that the aid crossings to the south have been closed down, no aid was getting in, it feels like there's a grave urgency for that. The first ship has launched. It's only a day and a half's sailing time from Cyprus to get it to this facility. So why isn't it working?
I could believe anything, really. I could believe one side in a war is doing the sort of things you've implied there, as from a desperation point of view. That would be really horrible, but it happens. Equally, I've heard reports that the moment aid gets to any point of distribution, Hamas are there and they control the distribution from there. I've also heard reports that the first thing that happens to it, apart from it going to the people of Gaza, it gets sold on the black market. Now, I don't know whether any of this is true, but it's pretty difficult to work out, sitting here, which of those different stories is true or not.
It is. I think it takes me back, though, to when I was in Afghanistan and in Kabul for a year, and we were nothing to do with the military. We were helping out a couple of the orphanages out there, and we were selling pashmina scarves in the UK and helping fund a little bit of medical care and education in these orphanages. When I left, there was a question about how do you continue supporting it, and several of the sponsors and the supporters said, how can you guarantee that the money isn't being siphoned off somewhere or whatever? And the honest answer was, I can't. But does that mean you don't provide it because at least some of it's getting through, or do you only do it if you can guarantee 100% of it's getting through? And it feels like the same. There is, I believe, the aid agencies that say there's a humanitarian disaster in Gaza. I believe that there are a lot of people starving in Gaza, and I believe that unless aid flows in there, that there'll be people dying, and you'll make the system work.
Yeah. So why doesn't Egypt put 1,000 boots on the ground to control the aid, or some of the other countries around there? Why don't they take it? If it's such a disaster, which it is, and everybody's up in arms about it, some people are, going to point the finger at Israel. Why aren't those same countries, those same people, those same leaders who have power, they have military, why aren't they there controlling the delivery and the division, the distribution of aid? They're not.
No, and there's a conversation, isn't there, about whether the United Nations should be involved in some way. The trouble is, it is an active war zone at the moment, and how you guarantee security for people. It's back to this little bit pregnant question. The US military, the UK military, we've been dropping aid from military aircraft. We've been providing surveillance and drones support, but we don't want to get as far as putting boots on the ground.
No, we don't, but Egypt could. Why isn't Iran in there? They got power, they got military, they got might, they got money.
Would the West accept Iran?
They don't have to accept it. They could just go in and say, we're here, we've got white flags, we're here to make sure the aid gets through to the people.
But since Iran's sponsoring Hamas, then you pretty much guarantee it'll all go to Hamas then.
And there we have it, maybe.
Yeah.
Sean, I got a bit scared the other day. I heard some news that Russia had been developing a intercontinental ballistic system that carries nuclear warheads. It was announced, a couple of years ago, but it's come back up in the news, obviously because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. This particular, each individual missile can destroy 2,000 Hiroshimas. Not they've got the same power as 2,000 times the bomb that was used on Hiroshima, but could take out 2,000 towns like Hiroshima. Now, it could be all puff and bluster, but if that's true or anywhere near true, that sounds quite worrying.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating about the whole, let's say right at the start, the concept of nuclear war is abhorrent. Nobody wins. It's the end of life as we know it. The whole concept was mutually assured destruction. That's why it's a deterrence, because Russia has by far the biggest arsenal in the world of nuclear weapons. The START, I think it was called, set of agreements between the US and Russia turned around and limited the number of missiles. But that made people like me think that might be safe. And when you actually looked at what that limited it to, it meant something like you can only destroy the world twice over. So any concept of nuclear war is abhorrent, and if it ever starts, frankly, we're saying goodbye
Done.
anyway.
Yeah.
Part of the issue about weapons, though, is you obviously got to keep upgrading them. Satan II is the most recent one from Russia. It was apparently finished in 2018, but they did the first flight of the latest variant 2 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't think it's any great surprise that Russia is beating its nuclear saber again, because none of these weapons are actually brand new. There's a new submarine that's going, the Bolivar, which is just been launched, which is firing all of these missiles as well. I think what Russia's doing, and it's traditionally always done this, is it's beating its chest, showing how militarily capable it is, because it knows that if the West is to intervene in the war in Ukraine, it will be stopped. And therefore, to date, lots of the international political leadership have been scared by that rhetoric. It's worked.
Yeah. Well, I'm a victim of big numbers, like anybody else. And the big numbers on this one, and, you might correct me, the big numbers are that each individual missile can travel 18,000 kilometers. That means all four corners of the globe are accessible. It can divide into 15 separate individually targeted warheads, each with, much more power than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And it can reach any of the major cities in NATO within 100 seconds, which doesn't give you long to respond.
No, and again, we go down a path here, which is Operation Certain Death. If mankind is stupid enough to press the nuclear button, then it will be the end of all life, virtual life on Earth. So I refuse to get worried about it, because we're all going to die at some stage. If it happens to happen at a time like that, how stupid would humanity be? And actually, Russia has no motivation whatsoever to start a nuclear campaign, because it would suffer just the same way as the rest of the world would. But what it's doing is saber rattling. It's traditionally done this to keep the West at bay. Well, both of us, we grew up in the Cold War era. We talked about,
You're old enough to have done that, right?
So the Cuban Missile Crisis, we've talked about that before. So I'm probably less sensitized, or more sensitized, less concerned about all this rhetoric, because we're a long way away from a nuclear war. But that doesn't stop Putin recognizing that in a relatively soft underbellied Europe, and indeed US,
which it is at the moment.
It is at the moment, that rhetoric is causing Western leaders to pause and think. It's causing them to go, I don't want to get involved.
Yeah.
And yet, if you follow that logic through, which we did the other day, we're effectively saying, Russia, you do what you like. You go into Ukraine, it's not nuclear power, we can't do anything about it. If it come into NATO, we might do something about it. What about the whole of the African continent and all of the minerals?
Yeah, it's a problem. I mean, I think the West has been a little weak historically, for safety's sake. So if you remember the famous Obama red line with Syria, if you attack your own people, you will cross a red line and you will pay for it. What did he do when they did? Nothing.
Nothing.
Absolutely nothing. Crimea? Nothing.
But it is a high stakes game of poker. I mean, I had a fair bit, because on...
You could be my best friend then, in that case. Because this does worry me slightly. So I'm going to stick with you, Sean.
No, but I mean, so it happens regularly in Sky. People pull me aside and go, I'm really scared. You go, don't be. What are you scared of? I mean, if it happens,
I can't
it happens.
do anything about it anyway.
You can't do anything about it. No. And actually, the very principles of it, of what's kept this world safe, because the consequences of doing it are horrendous. It's only happening today because Putin is rattling his sword, because he knows that he's trying to stop the West get involved. And the danger is, if we don't get involved, the consequences for the West are profound.
Yeah. Well, so, okay, let's not be scared, but it is a fascinating weapon, isn't it? Apparently, and I say this because of your comments about how difficult these things are actually to shoot down. Travels
How did they go again? Oh, okay. Got it. Thank you.
Mach 27. Now, I know the majority of that is in space. It's got to come down.
It slows down a bit when it comes.
But it's still going pretty fast, and it's very, very, very difficult to shoot down.
It's difficult to shoot down in that transit phase. It's less difficult to shoot down when it comes back into atmosphere, but it doesn't leave long for you to react to it.
Yeah.
Range, I think people talk about, the Satan II you're talking about is the biggest, longest range ballistic missile that's on this planet. That's a worry. Right. One of the reasons we have nuclear submarines, a continuous at-sea deterrent, as does the US, is those submarines put anywhere in the world in the reach of any of the nuclear weapons available, and Russia will never know where those missiles are at any one time. So the fact you've got a long-range missile, it means it's a very big missile, which means you know where it's based, which means that actually it's vulnerable. The submarine threat, you don't know where it is. You're only going to know when these things fire, and there's so many of them that some will get through. So the danger of the rhetoric about large and the whole of the world is within range of these things anyway. So I think we need to park that. The second one is the US, I think, has the largest known nuclear weapon. I think it's called the B-83, 1.2 megatons, and that's apparently 60 times the explosive power of the bomb that was used in Nagasaki. Now, Nagasaki, I'm a student of history, you look at that and think, wow. But bluntly, you're either dead or you're alive, and the blast, whether it's a massive area or a smaller area, Nagasaki was pretty awful. And my worry here is people talk about tactical nuclear weapons as if they might be
less impactful, less destructive. Yeah.
A lot of the tactical nuclear weapons are several times as powerful as those that were used in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Don't kid ourselves. These aren't a sort of little explosion.
One of those could take out a small country.
Yeah. So the whole reason is that when we talk about nuclear war and that we don't have that differentiation. You can't be a little bit pregnant. You either do it or you don't. And therefore, the fact that Russia has some doctrine that talks about battlefield nuclear weapons that could potentially be used. Again, the value of nuclear weapons is in the threat. It's in the saber rattling of it all. Would Russia have gone into Ukraine had it still got the nuclear weapons that it had at the collapse of the Soviet Union? Almost certainly not. And for me, that's the bigger worry now, is that if we don't do anything in response to Putin's saber rattling, more countries will want to get nuclear weapons because they'll know that they can get away with murder. And Iran, when it gets nuclear weapons, what does that mean for the rest of the world? What does that mean for our own domestic security? There's some profound questions that need to be answered here, and they're not going to be answered by just sitting back and going, oh, okay, no, we don't want to get involved.
Sean, we've often, 2 years on in Ukraine, we've often referred to the war as a war now of attrition. In other words, you just keep on pounding the other side. You use your superior power and weaponry, and in the end, the other side just basically caves in or gives up. It can feel a bit like that at the moment. And one of the big issues is the amount of weaponry, munitions, shells, bullets, and so on you've got. It appears that maybe on both sides, but certainly on the side of Ukraine, they're struggling and they've got a shortage, and that's going to matter on the battlefield. The largest source of casualties on a battlefield come from shells exploding.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. We're going to drill into this, aren't we, a little bit over the coming weeks. As 2 years into the war, we talk about Ukraine being short of munitions and weapons and desperately needing them from the West. We're going to actually start looking at some of the individual weapons because, one of the reasons the West was able to support Ukraine was in high-tech weapons, precision weapons, surgical strike, which are very compelling, and that's how the West has invested in the future. The trouble is they're quite expensive. You don't produce many of them and don't have many in a stockpile. Whereas exactly as you said, artillery shells, they may not be sexy end of the munitions market, but they are responsible for most of the casualties in war. At the start of this war, Russia had 7 million artillery shells in storage, and its industry was producing 1 million shells a year. Now, since the start of the war, Russia's spun up its industrial capacity. It's now, last year did 3.5 million it made. This year expects to be 4.5 million. And it's imported 1 million from North Korea. Do the maths. Now look at Ukraine, hasn't been able to deliver any of its own, And the West, Europe, said, right, we'll pledge 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine this year. And so far has only managed to deliver about 30% of those. So when faced with those sorts of maths, you start to think, how on earth can Ukraine prevail? And it's slightly worse than that, because the Russia artillery rounds are 152 millimeter. That's the diameter of the round. Former Soviet Union guns, that's what they use. Ukraine, they had former Soviet Union guns as well, 152 millimeter rounds. What's the West been giving them? Because we don't operate 152 millimeter, we operate 155 millimeter rounds, slightly bigger. They don't fit, so we've had to provide them the guns as well. So all of a sudden now, they've got loads of guns that they haven't got the ammunition for. They've got some great guns, but they haven't got enough ammunition for that. Now, the 155 millimeter is slightly more accurate and goes slightly further. But what a logistics nightmare to try and get these two different sorts of rounds. You can imagine you're there blasting away on the front line and there's rounds available, but not in the size that fits in your gun. And this is creating... Now, the one thing that the West has provided, though, is counter-battery radar. So if you're the enemy now and you're firing your gun at me, this radar will very accurately track where that round is coming from.
And what they're going to fire at it.
They'll fire another one of their 155 millimeter back, but rather than just firing arbitrarily, you now got a very accurate grid reference of where that Russian gun is, and you can fire your gun fairly accurately and therefore target that gun. That means that you don't need anything like the number of rounds to be effective. And also you cause less collateral damage.
And the Russians doing the same? Or
They are. They have their own counter-battery radars, but they don't have anything like the number, and they're nothing like as effective. Their technology, again. The trouble is, in any of these wars, quantity, as I regularly say, has a quality all of its own. And these artillery shells, I think they said that Ukraine needs as a minimum 1.5 million a year. That's about 4,000 a day. These rounds are about 45 kilograms each. So it's about 180 tons of ammunition every day. That is a massive logistics challenge, even if the West could produce it. And the worry here is that for the viewers, we don't talk a lot about artillery shells because it's not the form of warfare that the West generally wants to fight.
Doesn't sound very sexy either.
No, but that's what's giving Russia the edge on the battlefield. And it's very difficult for Ukrainians to withstand the onslaught, particularly when you've got no weapons or ammunition to take it out in return. So, and it's not something that the West, despite all the rhetoric, where's the plan? We're over 2 years into this war now, and even now, to my knowledge, we've not seen a plan to get anywhere close to matching what the Russian production facility is.
Okay, so if you boil it all down, you could say the amount of shells you've got of the right size could be one of the big determining factors of who wins the war.
I think without being melodramatic, absolutely it will be, because they are cheap and cheerful, but you need the volume. And at the moment, the West can't produce that volume.